Good morning. Thank you for coming today and sticking with this. I know it's been a long few days, but I think it's worth it to have these conversations together. So I'm looking forward to that conversation. So my time with you is to present the preferential option for the poor as a hermeneutical key for reading Laudato Si, and to that effect, for reading Laudato Si as a bookend with the pastoral Evangelium, Evangelicarium. So Joy of the Gospel and Care of Creation as two interrelated documents that give us Francis's view on the option for the poor as how to read Catholic social teaching. So, one of the things that I've seen one of the connections to this that I've seen in Laudato Si is the human impact of climate change with respect to the poor. And just as a note, the poor are mentioned 65 times in the document, and creation is mentioned 66 times. So really, it is an encyclical on the poor, and that's been referenced here many times, right? That it is a justice encyclical, not just an ecological encyclical. But impact of climate change as affecting entire communities, often poor or racially marginalized, and I'll come back to that. Care for the environment as a matter of environmental justice, a term that brings together care of nature and care for the poor as interrelated and interdependent practices in Christian ethics, so that we can't say that we're taking care of one area and not look at the other one, so that environmental ethics directly impacts what happens to poor, marginalized communities. And I wanted to begin with two particular examples or stories. One is an Occupy course that I taught 2 years ago. I taught a course on the Occupy movement. And in true Occupy pedagogy, I planned half the course and then allow the students together to plan the second half of the course. And one of the groups decided to do their unit on the fashion and garment industry. And what I learned from them was, in fact, the impact, the high cost of cheap fashion, which is actually the title of a book by Elizabeth Klein, 2012, and the impact of the garment industry on the environment and on people, right? Again, that interrelated mesh of how consumption affects both environment and people. So how does it do this? The amount of water used in the garment industry is quite significant. And then the dyes, that's the second picture, the dyes that are then utilized and disposed among a lot of other chemicals, whether it's working with cotton and natural fibers, but also working with polyesters and artificial fibers, put out a lot of toxic materials right into the environment, often in countries that have little to no regulation, and often into water sources that are directly utilized by people. So there's no buffer between the toxins that leave the production of garments and the people in the communities surrounding them and using that water source. In addition, people involved in the production of cheap clothing are exposed to abusive conditions, overtime, 10, 15, 18-hour days that with no overtime pay, with very little pay, in dangerous conditions. And you can recall a few years back the crumbling of the Rana Plaza building in Bangladesh. That was 2013. And everything is connected, right? So the consumption that Francis talks about in Laudato Si comes to light when it impacts real people. So over 1,100 people died in this particular collapse of this building, and it led to identifying what do we buy that is made there. So Children's Place, Gap, Walmart got a lot of their clothes from these kinds of operations in Bangladesh. On the consumer side of the garment industry is these massive amounts of donated clothes that has become its own industry in the US, and that we donate thinking that, well, they're reaching either people who need this, or they're reaching other countries who need it, or can be resold for profit or for charities. And the truth is that often these bales end up either incinerated or dumped in other countries, and they themselves have to dump it around them because it doesn't get sold, it doesn't get used, and there's efforts around different African countries to try to deal with the high volume of donated clothing that they receive from the United States. Alternatively, another student from that working group had actually herself grown sheep in a farm in Vermont, and sheared the sheep and made, threaded it and spun it, and then knitted sweaters from these sheep. And so that's our classroom, brought in her own spinning wheel and everything and showed us what the wool felt like and what the different processes were. And the question was at the end, why would anyone care to buy, at the end she told us the real cost of a sweater that she makes from wool to sweater is around $500 to $600. She says, why would anyone do that when H&M sells you a wool sweater for $25? But what is lost when we make that transition into industrial garment production? So all these scenes confirm that everything is connected. Cheap clothing have a high cost to our environment and our workers and communities. The land and the human family suffer directly and indirectly from an unfettered desire to buy one more piece, just one more. Conversely, local industries, particularly farming and local ecologies, are devastated by the move to commercial production of clothing. Centuries-old strategies for relating to the land, and she actually did a whole thing about the biblical census of textiles and thread and what that meant in the Bible, and how she used it in terms of having the sheep and caring for the sheep as well. So the second example, our water crisis, right? And Sandra brought that up in terms of water as a sacramental deep ecology piece. But it's one of the biggest victims of, or a first impact victim from a lot of our consumption. And so recently, 3 different water disasters that we can relate to are the lead poisoning of water in Flint, Michigan, the copper mining dam break in Minas Gerais, that was in November, I believe, and then Elk River poisoning from runoff from the tanks that hold the byproduct of coal mining. Even though, well, supposedly they have been looked at, the tanks, but they still weren't up to standard, and some of them leaked, and the contamination of the Elk River was significant, and even to this day, they cannot guarantee the safety of that drinking water, which impacts a lot of families in West Virginia. But so these examples highlight that access to safe drinking water, safe air to breathe, and safe dirt to use for growing our food is more and more becoming the exclusive purview or the exclusive privilege of upper-class white communities. Since the 1980s, different sources have recorded the increased exposure to toxic environmental conditions to communities of color and low socioeconomic status. A study from 2007, this is what this is taken from, this appeared in The Nation recently, found that, quote, communities near commercial hazardous waste facilities consisted mainly of people of color. In 1987, so a while back, or when this began to be a conversation in the United Church of Christ Commission on Racial Justice, they lifted up the phenomenon and termed it environmental justice, noting that care for the earth must go hand in hand with attention to unjust conditions for marginalized, oppressed, and excluded groups locally and globally. So that right now, what this Nation article was stating is that being a person of color is a bigger determinant in the US about whether you'll be exposed to toxic runoff, to water issues, dirty air, et cetera, than any other demographic marker in our population. So what I hope to do is to highlight how the poor are the real protagonists of Laudato Si, hinging on the hermeneutic of the preferential option for the poor. and to read Laudato Si through the lens of the option for the poor brings together social justice and earth justice as intimately connected and as requirements of the Christian life. Perhaps if reading Laudato Si in the key of the option for the poor is a bit of a stretch, then again, as I suggest, as I mentioned earlier, that it is a bookend with Evangelii Gaudium, where the option for the poor appears very clearly stated. And some have referred to this as Francis's theology of encounter, his emphasis on globalization of indifference, and special attention to mercy as a central attribute of divine life and identity. But I'd like to suggest that our reading of both documents, and of Laudato Si specifically, suffers if we don't pay attention to Francis's appreciation for the option for the poor. Conversely, what I would like to do in the second part of the chapter, and we've been mentioning that this is a project to develop a book for, a textbook for undergraduate education, is to talk about the kinds of attitudes and the kinds of practices that prevent us from taking on the challenge of reading environmental damage from the perspective of the option for the poor, such as racism, classism, and xenophobia, for example. As with other social encyclicals, conflict arises when the best of intentions, in this case to save the planet, runs into our inability to overcome the racism, xenophobia, and classism that mark human interactions in this country and globally. And yet embedded in Laudato Si, we find potential ways of integrating social justice and ecological concerns in ways that make it impossible for us to ignore the ways in which our systems of consumption impact the human family, with the poorest sectors bearing the initial and most significant brunt. So, Evangelii Gaudium and Laudato Si, the preferential option for the poor as a hermeneutical key. As I said before, the poor appear 65 times in Laudato Si. The documentary history of Catholic social thought presents the different challenges in which to concretely live out the call of the option for the poor and solidarity, attentive to the suffering of the world. But I think it was Tony Annett who said yesterday that he feels Laudato Si is one of the most significant pieces on economic justice in Catholic social teaching. And I would agree. As its most recent edition, it expresses it thusly. So this sister Earth, this is from Laudato Si, now cries out to us because of the harm we have inflicted on her by our irresponsible use and abuse of the goods with which God has endowed her. And this is Laudato Si number 2, which is, I found it curious that it's also the number 2 of the Medellin document section on the poverty of the church, which it echoes. A deafening cry pours from the throats of millions of men asking their pastors for a liberation that reaches them from nowhere else. So you have here language that echoes this call for the option for the poor to be how we read environmental justice. And then we also have the mention, cry of the earth and cry of the poor. That phrase was mentioned yesterday. It's also the title of Leonardo Boff's, one of his most significant contributions to liberation theology. And at a session at the American Academy of Religion, Barbara Muraca, who's a I'm gonna have to read this. Barbara Muraca, who's a post-growth and sustainability philosopher, talked about the, Erin was there, right? Talked about the hidden or the unstated bibliography of Laudato Si and how liberation theology and post-growth literature from Europe, a lot of literature is integrated, and I kept seeing people referencing what some of these texts were, and I'm glad I had heard about it earlier because I'm not in the know as some of you are, and so I wouldn't have noticed ahead of time. But I want to bring Evangelium Gaudium and how it defines the option for the poor, how it begins to bring the option for the poor as the key for Francis's social thought. In its section on the inclusion of the poor in society, Francis states, each individual Christian and every community is called to be an instrument of God for the liberation and promotion of the poor and for enabling them to be fully a part of society. And it brings up solidarity as working to eliminate the structural causes of poverty and to promote the integral development of the poor, as well as small daily acts of solidarity in meeting the real needs which we encounter. And it, again, establishes it, which is something that is also in the document on the poverty of the Church of Medellin, that none of us can think that we are exempt from concern for the poor and for social justice, which means every Christian, every person of faith, is called to make the well-being of the poor a priority in their life as part of the call to discipleship. So attentiveness to the cry of the poor, which Vince focused on attentiveness yesterday as one of the elements of Laudato Si, developing an ability to listen to the vulnerable and oppressed is the responsibility of every Christian and every community, and a necessary first step to true solidarity. Therefore, Francis includes a section on particular voices of the poor, women, the indigenous, trafficked peoples, migrants, the unborn. This is still in Evangelii Gaudium, who are frequently at the mercy of economic interest or indiscriminate exploitation. Francis is speaking of creation as a whole and proposes that we, quote, not leave in our wake a swath of destruction and death which will affect our own lives and those of future generations, end quote, from Evangelium Gaudium. So in Evangelium Gaudium, Francis reframes the seamless garment of life through the lens of the preferential option for the poor, bringing together the life of all Christians with that of the poor and suffering and that of the land, the waters, and the air, in a common journey of solidarity, of solidary love and struggle for justice. In Laudato Si, environmental justice for the poor and care of creation are brought together and intimately linked throughout in ways that challenge previous notions of complicity and conflict in Catholic social teaching, I think, anyway, a point that I will discuss later. Like the command to be attentive and listen to the cry of the poor in Evangelium Gaudium, the poor are highlighted as particularly affected by the rapid and detrimental changes that climate change imposes on swaths of poor populations globally, such as those living in coastal areas and small island nations, downstream of dump sites, or downstream of disasters like the dam break in Minas Gerais, or the leak of chemical from coal production in West Virginia, mentioned above. The ravages to the environment are linked to the destiny of the marginalized communities nationally and internationally through the direct and immediate impact of having to migrate to avoid natural disasters, to avoid lack of resources, and the conflict and violence that erupts as a result of this. So one example to note is the theory or the thought that the current situation in Syria is a result of a drought that began in 2006 or that was exacerbated in 2006 and mobilized a lot of people to the urban centers, causing a lot of unemployment, a lot of friction, a lot of tension between groups living together and giving rise to an instability. So perhaps not the central reason, but certainly a really significant one for why we are now in the place that we are with Syria. Let me speak a little bit about conflict, the role of conflict in Laudato Si. So in Laudato Si, acknowledgement of the relationship between environmental justice and justice for the poor, framed through the lens of the option for the poor, returns to the question of whether Catholic social teaching gives conflict an appropriate place in its heritage and the way it explains social phenomena and possibilities for transformation. The document presents humanity's effect on the environment as violence, right? It's one of the texts, violence that is in our hearts and that our sin has occasioned against the earth and against the poor. And then we also see conflict in that environmental justice, understood as justice for the poor, brings conflict with the status quo of market capitalism, a conflict easily observed in the oppositional ways in which the encyclical was received, interpreted, and interpreting what next steps. So just in that, you can tell that some of the action steps, some of the recommendations do themselves pose conflict, even if in the text it is not acknowledged as such. Conflict surfaces more specifically in the document's discussion on water, again, which Sandra had mentioned, as a human right, itself a contested concept. So he mentions it and takes it for granted that water is a human right, knowing that very well that this is still an international discussion about whether it's a human right. In the discussion on the dangers of ignoring the harm to the environment done by war, and in setting the terms for dialogue on climate change and ways to address it, where typically only certain segments of the global society are present. On this last point, Francis is quite poignant as he notes how often even so-called international efforts to address climate change obey the dynamics of political and economic power by being housed in the centers of commerce, privileging the voices of powerful players, and where the last thing that gets addressed is a direct impact on the poor and vulnerable. In these conversations, the poor remain at the bottom of considerations for environmental sustainability because, and this is the quote from Laudato Si, many professionals, opinion makers, communications media, and centers of power being located in affluent urban areas are far removed from the poor, with little direct contact with their problems. They live and reason from the comfortable position of a high level of development and a quality of life well beyond the reach of the majority of the world's population. This lack of physical contact and encounter, often encouraged at times by the disintegration of our cities, can lead to a numbing of conscience and to the tendentious analysis which neglect parts of reality. And it's really been a privilege to be here with people like Bob and Otmar and others who have talked to me a little bit about how these conversations go that Francis is referring to here, because it's goodwill, very well-intentioned people who do have the poor in mind, who do have this impact in mind, and there are dynamics that we need to explore of how to get more people to the table, the people that Francis says should come to the table as well to have these conversations. So I really thank you for these conversations. That has been very enlightening. But it is the section on global inequality that incorporates the deepest understanding of the role of conflict in the document. Here, Francis explains that the anthropological failure, we heard some of that yesterday, of the consumer era shapes indifference to human suffering and vulnerability. Most especially prevents us from understanding where these might be, and indeed are shared vulnerabilities, not just those of the poor. Lack of an understanding of shared vulnerabilities gets in the way of us understanding what potentials for solutions are. They make us myopic to how to really address the problem. And it also perpetuates efforts based on the lie that the Earth's resources are unlimited if only we can tap into technologies and know-how that will expand our capacity and overcome perceived scarcity. Francis states that, quote, the deterioration of the environment and of societies affects the most vulnerable people on the planet. And then he quotes the Bolivian Bishops' Conference. Both everyday experience and scientific research shows that the gravest effect of all attacks on the environment are suffered by the poorest. So in his view, the scientific evidence points itself to the need for the option for the poor to be the way, the lens through which we address this. There's also another sense in which conflict comes into play is Francis's view of colonial dynamics between North and South. So he talks about a true ecological debt between the global North and the South, quote, connected to commercial imbalances with effects on the environment and the disproportionate use of natural resources by certain countries over long periods of time. And someone like Willie Jenkins, for example, African-American theorist and ethicist, talks about the colonial racism that allowed massive extraction from, the conquest. So we're talking, he goes back to the 15th century and proposes that this colonial racism is active even to today. So reflecting on relationships of inequality with respect to care for the earth, Francis again warns that there are different levels of responsibility. We've talked about differentiated responsibility here between powerful nations and other nations, with industries that dominate the laws of global markets and use of natural resources and what they owe to poorer nations who have historically been on the receiving end of unjust economic relations. So in the end, and I know I'm coming up to the end of my time, but one of the things that I get frustrated with Catholic social teaching, I'm just gonna go off script here, very Francis-like, is this resort to conversion of hearts, right? And that conversion of hearts ultimately is what's going to transform society. And as a liberationist, that rubs against me because I feel like I don't have time for you to convert your heart. I don't have time for that. And there's an urgency about what is going on that we've heard in these past few days, that means that conversion of heart is beautiful and we should strive for that, and it's necessary. But in the end, it needs to go hand in hand with deep and serious policymaking that is going to force the hand of global companies and be able to do international agreements that have teeth and that will have an impact in the short and in the long term. And those cannot be separated. But as a Christian, and I love that Sandra's presentation came first, we have to believe that grace operates, and where sin abounds, grace abounds even greater. And so conversion, the role of conversion can be a radical option, can be a radical way to speak to the policymakers. So what would be some of these things? So when we get to these sections, when we get to chapter 6, what are we, what's that called? Ecological education and spirituality. So you have the integral ecology, then you have an approach and action in terms of the chapters of Laudato Si. Then the last chapter, ecological education and spirituality, which is where the conversion piece is housed. The poor sort of disappear. Okay, in terms of, remember I said the poor appear 65 times? But conversion has to be to something. And I know that conversion primarily means, in liberation theology, the word liberation, everything has a threefold meaning, right, because it's Trinitarian. In that threefold meaning, one of the meanings is liberation from sin, which only happens in Christianity through Christ. So conversion has to be to Christ, but it also has to be to the poor, because that is Christ among us, right? That's Matthew 25. So conversion has to be toward the poor, and we need to be a little more decisive about talking and preaching this. Conversion toward the other, the racial, religious, ethnic, political, and economic other, and their experience must be a central dimension of a response to environmental justice grounded on the preferential option for the poor. Conversion toward those at the border, refugees and migrants, from the environmental impact. And the fact that we are still, that we are still trying to not even decide, that we still have to advocate to label Central American peoples at our border, that we can't label them as refugees, which they are, is absurd. And so that kind of terminology is very important, and I think conversion can be also a conversion of language, of how we use our terms. Conversion away from dynamics of victimization, such as environmental racism, to really face up to what the decades of racism and segregation and designing of urban societies and suburban bodies have caused certain groups to always be the victims of our environmental dumping in the US, and being able to advocate for them. And then conversion to presence, and that's a big piece, and that's a big piece for Francis, presence, right? And if the option for the poor, I interpret the option for the poor as the incarnational principle of divine love. The option for the poor as the incarnational principle of divine love. If it's incarnational, it has to be present. We have to enter the world of the poor somehow. So conversion to presence means being in lo cotidiano. This is from Latino theology, the everydayness of those who suffer from a toxic addiction, of the just one more philosophy of consumption. And I mean, it's that issue of the water in Flint, and having to see 2 bottles of water, and their daily lives being that they couldn't consume it. And the way it's related, so we have Flint, very poor community, mainly African American, Hispanic or Latin American communities in Flint didn't find out of the crisis until recently, because of language barriers, because all the flyers that were being posted and all the announcements were in English. In addition, those who did know had been warned that there were going to be raids, ICE raids at distribution centers. So they thought that if they went to get the free water that the churches were bringing and giving away, so that they could make formula for their babies and make coffee, Jesus, coffee, you know? So they were scared to go and get free water. So there's different levels of how people bear the brunt of the toxicity that we produce in our environment for a host of reasons, and I know they're complicated, but just to kind of consider how it is that we impact different communities. All right, so I'll close with this. This is not from Laudato Si, and we were talking about this morning. Francis tones his message differently for different communities. But at the World Meeting of Popular Movements in Bolivia, where he had met with them in his trip, it was it's the message that Tony brought up yesterday, where he was very adamant about what conversion away from current economic systems would look like. He says, in terms about being present, so this is the presence piece, that popular movements fulfill this. They are present. They're popular movements, but they're in the midst. They're advocating, they're policy activists in the midst of those who suffer. This rootedness in the barrio, the land, the office, this ability to see yourself in the faces of others, this daily proximity, it's very incarnational, right, to their share of troubles and their little acts of heroism. This is what enables you to practice the commandment of love. Not on the basis of ideas or concepts, but rather on the basis of genuine interpersonal encounter. Right. So I'll stop there. Thank you.